Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, David Lepeska, and with me today is Ayhan Kaya, professor of politics at Istanbul Bilgi University and author of Populism and Heritage in Europe, published last September. Thanks so much for joining us, Ayhan. Hello.
Thank you very much, David. Hi.
We are talking on Thursday, March 5th. There's been a lot of talk in recent days about European hostility toward Muslims and Islam, mainly as a result of two recent developments. French President Emmanuel Macron launching a national campaign against radical Islam, and the apparently anti-Muslim attack in Hanau, Germany last month, in which 9 people were killed, including 5 of Turkish-Kurdish origin. Pro-government Turkish news outlets, perhaps you are aware, have been blaming all this on rising Islamophobia linked to the increased popularity of the far right in Europe. You've said that far-right supporters tend to be Islamophobes, and in your book, you write that the manifesto of the far-right Alternative for Germany Party, or AfD, revolves around anti-Muslim sentiments. So I wonder, do you think the Turkish view is right? To what extent do you think the rise of far-right parties in Europe has contributed to increased anti-Islam sentiment and rising attacks on Muslims?
Well, David, the answer to this question is both yes and no. It is yes, because there is obviously a really growing tide of Islamophobia in Europe since basically 1974 oil crisis. And this Islamophobia has become even stronger after 9/11, and it continues to be stronger. It continues to be stronger because of the financial crisis 2008 and the refugee crisis 2015, and now it's even becoming bigger. So this is the fact. But on the other hand, the answer is no, because when the Turkish government is underlining the growing impact of Islamophobia on the migrants in Europe, it is doing this from a rather more Islamist perspective. So it is in a way trying to legitimize its Islamist perspective, instrumentalizing the Islamophobic sentiments in Europe. And this is exactly coming to the point where I'm actually recently trying to concentrate on. This is a kind of leading to co-radicalization of two different standpoints. On the one hand, Islamophobist, affiliations, Islamophobist inclinations, but on the other hand, Islamist inclinations. So we're living in such a world in which both kinds of radicalizations become really very visible in everyday life and politics.
Right. I'm going to get to that in a minute. First, your book, Populism and Heritage in Europe, examines the discourses used by European far-right groups to advance their agendas and prevent minority groups from being accepted. There's fieldwork in France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Holland, and Turkey, and you analyze how they use xenophobia, Islamophobia, and other issues to mobilize people who've been hit by the financial crisis and the 2015, 2016 influx of refugees. So I wonder if you could tell me specifically, how do you think the refugee crisis influenced or aided the rise of far-right populism in Europe? A recent opinion piece at Turkey's state-run Anadolu news agency argued that it was the main reason European fear turned into trauma and anger. Would you agree with that?
Well, at this moment in many parts of the European Union, there is certainly the trace of the negative externalities of the global financial crisis, which hit those remote places away from the capital cities. So remote places meaning agricultural sites, rural sites, mountainous sites. And this is exactly, these are the places where right-wing populism is really emerging for the last few years. So this is basically because of the relative or real social economic deprivation that many people in Europe are recently experiencing. But then for the rise of the right-wing populism, social economic deprivation is not the only factor. It needs another factor for the right-wing populist parties to really gain ground, to really become popular. And this second element is what I call the nostalgic deprivation, meaning that recent surveys also show that around more than 30% of the European population think that previously their country was better off socioeconomically, culturally, and politically. So there is this growing nostalgia for the past, for the past, yes, and this has become obvious, especially after the 2015 refugee crisis, because many of the things that the Europeans know by heart started to change. The views of the public about the everyday life changed. But it doesn't mean that this is really something interesting that we found out. It doesn't necessarily mean that right-wing populists are anti-refugee people. On the contrary, right-wing populist people are actually rather more, friendly towards the refugees because they know that they need help, they need aid, they need assistance, and plus, on top of everything, right-wing populist party supporters do not see the refugees as a as a competitor factor. But the rise of the refugees in everyday life, number of the refugee people and their images in the media have created another important challenge for the already existing economic migrants and their descendants in Europe. And because the existing economic migrants and their descendants are actually the competitors in economic life, in social life, in political life of the social, economically, and nostalgically deprived right-wing populist people. So what we have observed in our interviews was that the right-wing populist people are not necessarily against the refugees because they're not competing with them. On the contrary, this has created a greater and increasing discontent against the already existing economic migrants, be they Moroccans, Turks, Algerians, North Africans, or Indians, or Pakistanis, or etc.
But wait, let's just clarify. You say that far right supporters aren't necessarily prejudiced against refugees, but they are generally prejudiced against Muslims. I mean, they often express this concern and fear over this quote infiltration of Islam, and for the most part, I don't know, 80-90% perhaps of these refugees and migrant arrivals are Muslims.
Yes, I mean, this is exactly how it is. But then again, what we usually, I mean, one of the mistakes that we usually do in social sciences as well as in politics and everyday life, we assume that, for instance, we're talking about Islamophobia. We assume that it is just appeared, in parallel with the rise of the right-wing populism. But Islamophobia has always been there, as I, tried to explain earlier, since 1974 in modern times. And Islamophobia has always been instrumentalized by not only right-wing populist parties, extreme right-wing parties, but also quite a number of, central parties, mainstream parties. So there is an ongoing trend of instrumentalization of Islam, instrumentalization of civilizational rhetoric in the neoliberal times by the mainstream political parties, now the right-wing populist parties, to consolidate their supporters, their voters on a civilizational line in a way.
Well, we could say that Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment has been around since 1974 and the oil crisis, but I guess what I'm getting at is it's a much more successful strategy today because one, the Muslim populations in Europe are significantly larger than they were 4 decades ago, and number two, there are this clear and obvious threat in the news of these refugee waves coming and arriving and taking jobs, as you say. So, I mean, the sentiment may have been there, but now it's much more prevalent and much more effective as a campaign tactic. Is that not right?
It is absolutely right. I mean, the way I see this whole situation is that it starts with the changing, political climate in the world, which started with the dissolution of the USSR, and then communist ideology on the one hand, leading to the emergence of the Middle East as the geographical other since 1974, and then Islam replacing communism as a source of fear ideologically. So I see this, trend over the last 40 years. But you're absolutely right. The reason why this has become an alarming issue is, of course, the increasing number of images in the media of ISIS, of Al Qaeda, of Taliban beheading people and killing people. So the images in the media are certainly contributing to the rise of anti-Muslim sentiments in everyday life, of course.
Considering how this recent refugee wave has helped spur the rise of far right parties, the Turkish government has in recent days been encouraging migrants to try to cross into Europe as a way to force the European Union to come to its aid in regards to the humanitarian crisis in Syria's Idlib province, where some 2 to 3 million displaced people are squeezed between advancing Syrian troops and the Turkish border. I wonder what you think. What if Turkey were to open its Syrian border and allow these refugees to pass through Turkey and potentially flood into Europe like 2015, 2016? How might the arrival of another million or 2 million refugees shape far right attitudes in Europe?
Oh, that's that's a really difficult question. Well, David, first of all, I'm really personally very much disturbed for many years as a scholar working on migration issues about this politics of numbers, politics of statistics. 2 million, 3 million, 1 million, 100,000, etc. In the first place, we should be very well informed about the fact that political parties, state actors are often instrumentalizing numbers ideologically to make their point very strongly. The reason why I'm saying this is that there are different.
And I should just say this is what Erdogan often does, weaponizes these numbers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is not only, I could again, trace different, countries, different presidents, prime ministers, talking about the number of illegal immigrants in Australia, in the United States, in the UK. The highest number of illegal immigrants, irregular immigrants in Australia, for instance, are the British overstayers. In the United States, the highest number of irregular migrants or illegal migrants are the British overstayers. So this is what I'm, trying to say. So, but the point which I want to make is that I'm not really sure if it is 1 million, 2 million, or 200,000, 300,000 people waiting at the Turkish border in Syria, escaping from the Russian or Syrian atrocities, or betwixt in between the two sides in Idlib and around. Or on the other hand, I'm not really sure about the exact number of people that the Turkish government is, strong is always announcing. If it is 100,000 people who left the Turkish borders towards Greece and partly to Bulgaria, I'm not really sure about these numbers because we also have different numbers. But certainly, I think European Union is going through another, crisis. This is probably going to be called second refugee crisis. For the Turkish context, I think Turkish refugee crisis is just starting because previously, since 2011, when the exodus of Syrians started towards Turkey, since then Turkey has never called this as a crisis, unlike the European partners. But then in Turkey, it is really becoming a crisis because there is really a growing discontent against the refugees, against the Arabs. There is a growing Arabophobia, very similar to what we call Islamophobia in Europe. Turkish refugee crisis is starting, and the second European refugee crisis is starting, I would argue.
Many are saying that Greece's response to this wave of wannabe migrants encouraged by Turkey and Europe's support of that Greek response, and that Greek response has included Coast Guard vessels menacing
Yeah.
migrant boats and shooting tear gas and water cannons and potentially live rounds at migrants at the land border. It shows how that this response and Europe, the EU support of this response shows the extent of the European fear of the far right, which they see as likely being, encouraged by the arrival of more. What do you agree with that perspective?
Well, again, the question continues for the last few decades. Well, you can understand the European side, but it is all about securitization of migration. And on the other hand, again, you can understand the European Commission or European side, because many of these people are not necessarily refugees or asylum seekers. Many of these people are, trying to go to Europe for economic reasons. And, the common belief is that majority of these, because this is the way how it is discussed in the media, Syrians are, trying to go. On the contrary, among this, let's say 20,000, 30,000, or let's say even 100,000 people, around like 20% of them are Syrians. But whatever the case is, because most of the people are from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Eritrea, Somalia, Iran, etc. These are the people who are both partly escaping from the war, continuous war, but also partly for economic reasons, because most of these people are young people, male young people, which is also, of course, alarming for the European, short-term memory. Remember 2015 Cologne New Year's Eve celebrations, the sexual harassments, etc., etc. So these are all, very live fears. But the question is, to what extent the EU is really actively contributing to the reinforcement of global justice? To what extent the EU is, working hard to give an end to the conflicts in these war zones? And because of the Idlib crisis, now the EU is kind of becoming a bit more interested in taking part in the war in Syria. So I think the question is the fact that we're not really that successful, unfortunately, to make sure that there is a global justice in the world. And I really think that this is the main root cause of many questions, many problems that we are facing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That Anadolu opinion piece I mentioned before goes on to say that Germans believe in cultural diversity, but what Germans fear is the regional extinction of German culture. The piece points to the closure or merging of many churches, just as new mosques open almost every week, which has led to mosques being turned into an object of hate, thanks in part to far-right parties like AfD. Would you agree with this assessment of Germany, which I should mention is home to the world's largest Turkish diaspora community with some 3 to 4 million people of Turkish origin?
Well, listen, this is, of course, this depends on your framing of the issue. Yes, there is more than like 4 million Muslim origin people in Germany, and a majority of these people are living in Germany in peace and prosperity, speaking several languages, socioeconomically mobilized, etc., etc. Of course, there is a small minority who goes through some difficulties. But on the other hand, this is the first time we see in Germany that racism has really become, an issue to be discussed in public, in politics, at the highest level. And Steinmeier just yesterday said that, yes, we have a great problem called racism. We have a great problem called Islamophobia. So this is confirmed by the highest authority. But then again, going back to my first point, the Muslims, the Muslim origin people and their homeland governments should be careful in not making the crisis escalate even more by using a culturalist, Islamist, and civilizational discourse. On the contrary, we really need stronger, secular, liberal, scientific approaches to this, what I call co-radicalization of Islamophobism and Islamism. So this is the main issue that I personally see. And recently, I'm happy to see that in scholarship, in social sciences, the trend is going towards what I argue. This is also what I argue in my current European Research Council research on radicalization of youth in Europe, where I look at both the right-wing Islamophobists and the Islamist youngsters becoming more and more radicalized.
Right. I was just going to ask about that, actually. In the July 2018 speech on Europe versus Islam, you said you don't judge far-right supporters as racist, prejudiced, hateful, xenophobes. Instead, you look at their problems and concerns and what they want. And what you have found is that it's largely about marginalization, humiliation, and dignity, which are basically the same things that often drive Muslim migrants toward radicalization.
Exactly. I mean, we can just speculate. Imagine, we have a time machine, and then we assume that all these things that we are going through at the moment, we're going through back in the 1960s when the Marxist developmentalist paradigm was stronger rather than civilizational, religious, and culturalist identitarian paradigm of the present time. So if if these things were happening back in 1960s, these two groups, I argue, would collaborate together in alliance. In Gramscian terms, they would act together in alliance against the states that they were critical about. But today, they are not getting together because the main question here, the main problem here is the neoliberal state becoming more and more transnational, more and more globalist, more and more internationalist, forgetting about the problems of the poor, of the subjugated, living in the remote areas, racially excluded, socioeconomically, politically excluded, etc., etc. So what I argue is that these are actually two groups who are negatively impacted by the same detrimental effects of globalization, which is deindustrialization, poverty, exclusion, and humiliation. Humiliation is very important because humiliation may very well lead to radicalization and extremism and even terrorism, right? So these are the things that I'm recently working on, and I'm happy to see that many other scholars are also, coming to this point where they look at these two different forms of radicalization through the same socioeconomic and political and psychological lens, but not religious and cultural and civilizational lens.
You've received a European Research Council grant for a 5-year study of nativism, Islamophobism, and Islamism in the age of populism, which started last year. I think you're examining this similar process of radicalization on both sides, generated by the same sort of socioeconomic constraints. Please, if you could tell me a bit about this new study and how you're going about it.
Well, this has started last year, 1st of January 2019. And now we have just, started the field work in different cities in Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These are the countries where I have been conducting field research over the last more than 25 years. So the countries that I know very well. And we look at the Muslim origin youngsters becoming radicalized in the big cities, in the capital cities. And we're looking at the right-wing Islamophobic youngsters living in the remote cities where the populist parties are becoming stronger and stronger. And I have a group of researchers, native researchers, PhD students, postdocs from these four countries. And now we have started the first round of interviews, in-depth interviews with such youngsters. But the thing is, David, let me, tell you something I think very important. I think we have a problem with this notion of radicalization. Uh, I'm sure you will also remember, back in the past, back in 1970s, back in 1980s, even, these terms like radicalization, extremism, terrorism, fundamentalism, these were all actually separate terms signifying having different meanings. But nowadays, I'm really, I'm not surprised, of course, I know the reasons, but I'm not really happy with the fact that all these terms have been interchangeably used by politicians, by scholars, by journalists, by almost everyone. But radicalism, for instance, radicals of the 19th century were the Democrats, right? Fighting against the royal powers. Radicals of the 1960s were the liberal youngsters fighting against the patriarchal authority. And today we have different radicals using different instruments. Some of them are using Islam as a form of radicalism. Some are using nationalism and nativism as a form of radicalism. But the common denominator here is that they are not happy with the political structure. They are not happy with the domestic political constraints. They are not happy with the political center. They're not happy with the neoliberal forms of political governance. So this is really something interesting, and I really want to contribute to the generation of such a knowledge that there is no problem with radicalization. Radicalization is something very normal, and it needs to be understood as such. But
It's
of course,
interesting
we
that
have issues with extremism, fundamentalism, and terrorism. I mean, no one can really confirm these things, but we need to really be more, kind of nuanced about these notions.
in that 2018 speech I mentioned before, you cited Isaiah Berlin's comment that there's no universal solution to populism, and you argue that far-right populism is a very local phenomenon. I
Yeah.
found that interesting because of what we have witnessed in the last 8 or 10 years, populism spreading from Turkey across Europe to the United States and now even Brazil. As local as it may be, populism also seems almost viral. Why is
That
that?
that is a perfect point. Thank you for bringing that up, David. Yes, all kinds of things, populism, nativism, nationalism, radicalism, extremism, from an anthropological perspective, they are all local. But what makes them global, in the case of populism at least, what makes populism, right-wing populism, global is the ascendancy, is the rise of populist political style. This is a style. This is a political style. This is a political strategy to be used by many politicians, ranging from Trump to Putin to Wilders to Le Pen to many others. And this political style has certain, denominators, certain common points. They have an understanding of the world which is divided between two, good and evil, believers, non-believers. We see everywhere. These populist leaders are making it very obvious that they try to portray themselves as ordinary as possible to win the hearts of the people. But on the other hand, they use a lot of religious motives to present themselves as extraordinary individuals who deserve to be leader of these masses. And finally, they all have, they all rely on constant crisis. If there is no crisis, they create one. They like speculating. They like scandalizing. They have this really polarizing language. So we see all these instruments, all these themes, recurring themes, available in every right-wing populist leader at the moment. So the answer to your question is the rise of the populist style, and I'm afraid the mainstream political party leaders are also coming to the same point, trying to use the same style to at least consolidate their voters, their supporters. So this is what we call this is what Kasmude calls populist zeitgeist, populist times. This is why I use the term populist times in my title of the ERC research.
Mm. You also mentioned in that Europe versus Islam speech how one worker in Rotterdam had a problematic interpretation of increasing outspokenness on the part of second and third generation Turks in Europe. This made me wonder, as young Turkish and other Muslim Europeans become active, engaged citizens fighting for their rights, it seems like far-right supporters will continue to see this as radicalization, as a threat, which will lead to more animosity and clashes. So what's the solution to that?
Well, I mean, what happens now, for instance, specifically about the young Turkish origin, Dutch citizens or German citizens, they're not like their parents. Their parents were very much, in line with what was imposed on them by the states, by the majority societies. So they were really, in need of the tolerance to be shown by the host society in those days. But these youngsters have been raised in these countries, born in these countries, and now they're not really different from their Dutch or German peers. They know what they want. They know how to want. So remember 2005 French banlieue riots, when the North African youngsters were putting everything on fire in the banlieues, which belonged to the states. They put the schools on fire, they put the kindergartens on fire and everything. So this was a politics. Unfortunately, it was based on violence, but then violence is also an alternative form of politics, which becomes functional when legitimate political channels are not working for the disenfranchised, minority population. So this is again the same here, and I think what is happening in Europe among these Turkish origin youngsters is exactly the same. They have become outspoken, but this disturbs, of course, the native population, at least some part of the native population, who are socioeconomically in the same zone with these people, and who are actually competitors, who are actually trying to get the share from the same cake, in their own countries. So this needs to be resolved, and it is the state to resolve this competition. If the fight for competition is not resolved by the state, then of course chaos comes, then conflict comes, then radicalization or humiliation or extremism come, of course.
The mention of the state is a good lead into my next question. French President Macron recently declared that France does not want Muslim men who, quote, won't shake the hands of women, or Muslim women who, quote, won't go to a male doctor. But to me, this sounds like a potential violation of French secularism. What's your view of this idea that European countries may have to force some Muslims to integrate? To me, much like Erdogan's denunciations of Islamophobic Europeans, this stance seems likely to create more tensions.
Yeah. Well, we need the civic approaches, David. We need to really be critical against all kinds of civilizational, religious, culturalist rhetoric. We need a civic rhetoric immediately, because, yes, many states in Europe argue that they are secular or laicist. Take the example of France. French state is not, literally laicist. It may be laicist on the paper, or the Turkish state. It is laicist on the paper, but we know in practice that it is not laicist. So unfortunately, states have their own religions because states are run by individuals, different actors, and all these individuals have their own religions. In France, predominantly Catholic; in Turkey, predominantly Sunni Muslim. In social sciences, in sciences, in media, we need to try to generate this civic approach, meaning that let's forget about framing these people as mainly Muslims. The reason why these people are, holistically being framed as Muslims, I believe it's because those people, politicians, even scholars, media specialists, etc., those people who frame these people as predominantly Muslim, it is because of the fact that they are actually, in a way, reproducing their own culturally Christian position. This approach is counterproductive. Let's think that, well, these are also, let's say we are the state leaders and we're addressing at these people with migration backgrounds. Once we embrace them as our citizens who are in equal stance with the other citizens, let's not, revitalize the term, these religious terms, identifications such as Islam, Judaism, etc., etc. And I think this is one of the questions. The question for me is how how the leaders, how the states frame these people. Remember, back in 1960s, these people were framed only as workers. Back in 1980s, these people started to be framed by the states and politicians as ethnically Turkish, Kurdish, Bosnian, etc., etc. The framing of them as Muslims starts back in 1990s and especially after 2011 9/11 attacks. So I think the framing is the decisive element here. To answer your question, David.
Well, the framing has been rather successful. You say we need a more civic approach on both sides, but the far right parties in Europe, you acknowledge, have found considerable success using this anti-Muslim sentiment to drive their cause. And meanwhile, on the other side, Turkish President Erdogan uses this anti-European, Islamophobic, aggressive rhetoric to support his case, and both have found a level of success. So I wonder, it seems like it may be a while until we hear, a while before we hear this sort of civic approach you hope for.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that is the situation at this moment. Both civilizational rhetoric, Islamist and Islamophobist rhetoric, are really working because socioeconomic parameters, political parameters, psychological parameters have not really been there yet for the position to change. We need to find ways to tackle with the detrimental effects of globalization, with the social media, with the problems in the mainstream media, etc. The world is changing, of course, but we have not yet come up with, solutions to kind of balance this rapid change. Technology changes, politics change, but human beings do not really change so fast, so quickly. Societies, communities do not change so fast, so quickly. So this has always been like this. So I guess we all need to work hard to come up with some, resolutions to resolve all these emerging conditions. And I'm optimistic in the sense, at least I can see in social sciences, that the paradigm is changing. And I hope this paradigm change will also shift to the other spheres of life, like politics, like media, etc.
Professor Ayhan Kaya of Istanbul Bilgi University, thank you so much for your time and insight. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome, David. It was a pleasure for me as well. I wish you all the
Ahval podcastlerini tüm mobil telefonlarda Spotify, SoundCloud ve Spreaker üzerinden dinleyebilirsiniz. Apple iPhone kullanıcıları bize iTunes üzerinden de ulaşabilir. Türkiye'nin ve hayatın cıvıl cıvıl sesleri Ahval Podcast dizisinde. Kulağınız bizde olsun.